Intellectual Basis of British Strategic Foreign Policy 1900 to 1941. A 55-minute presentation sponsored by the Defence Studies Department, held on the 3rd of February 2006 at the Nelson Lecture Theatre in the Joint Services Command Staff College at Shrivenham. The speaker is Professor Keith Nielsen, who is a member of the History Department of the Royal Military College of Canada in Kingston, Ontario. He is a graduate of Cambridge University and is Canada's leading international historian. This lecture looks at the intellectual foundations of British defence policy in the interwar period 1919 to 1939. It argues that the changed international situation caused by the First World War meant that the British defence policy had to be constructed in a way that was compatible with such things as the League of Nations and disarmament. The failures of such efforts were not due to British weakness, but the inability of the New World Order to cope with such things as fascism, communism and Nazism. Professor Keith Nielsen.
Today I'd like to talk to you a little bit about some of the ideas behind British imperial defence and British strategic defence policy generally. I'm going to look at the period I know best, the 1920s and the 1930s for this, but I would argue that the general principles which I'm going to discuss here apply to a much wider range of time than that under consideration. So, historians of international relations and those who deal with defense policy are quite rightly skeptical of theory, leaving it, and I particularly am pleased here, to political scientists and other lesser breeds who don't do any research. Now, for historians, theory is unsatisfactory because it fails to explain the particular, either ignoring events that do not fit the model or just going on without them, and fails to provide an explanation that rises above the level of platitude. However, this does not mean that ideas are not important and, in fact, even essential to our understanding of international events. If historians are to rise above the kind of criticism that is often leveled against them by political scientists, that historians are mere chroniclers who have no explanation for what they write down, then it is vital to attempt to offer reasons for what occurs. And that's what I'm going to try to do here by looking at British imperial defense in the 1920s and 30s, and to try and show some of the hidden realities behind diplomacy and defense policy generally. Now, if most historians were asked what exactly lay behind British defense policy in the interwar period, after an embarrassed silence, they would likely say that it had to do with the balance of power, often evoking the name of Eyre Crowe, the clerk at the Foreign Office who wrote a famous memoranda about the balance of power in 1907, or start talking about appeasement or decline or something of this sort. Now, I would argue here that neither of these things provides a satisfactory explanation for British policymakers, for what the foreign policy-making elite attempted to do in the generation between the two world wars. Decline, I will simply say that it doesn't exist. It's a historical construct. It doesn't exist in the 1920s and 30s. If anybody wants to argue with me about this afterwards, I'll be quite willing to destroy their feeble efforts. And I will argue that this is something that only occurs after 1945 in the period of the superpowers. Now, the fundamental reason for a sea change in the intellectual underpinnings of British policy after 1919 was the legacy of the war. At the end of the First World War, four empires, the Austro-Hungarian, the German, the Russian, and the Ottoman, were all destroyed. And extra-European powers, as I've tried to point out in the previous lecture, especially the United States and Japan, had emerged as significant players in the global arena. Now, as well, there are profound changes to the British Empire. The British Empire reaches its zenith in terms of size after 1919, but as we shall see later, that this is also going to be affected by the intellectual changes that occur in this period. This has profound implications, this collapse of the European order, because before 1914, European politics means world politics. And the realities of the European system from at least 1815 to 1914 was that the great powers tended to generate amongst themselves a compensatory mechanism that reacted whenever anyone tried to assert a hegemony in Europe. That is to say, were Germany to attempt to assert its hegemony in Europe, it would be opposed automatically by the other powers surrounding it. If France were to do the same, this would also occur. Britain, in all of this, plays a position of balance before 1914. This doesn't mean that Britain has a position of splendid isolation, as is often used. Simply it means that because of geography, because of the Channel, and because of the strength of the Royal Navy, all elements, of course, that play into imperial defense, Britain has a choice, which is not offered to continental powers such as France, Germany, Russia, Austria-Hungary, as to when to intervene and how to intervene in these kinds of circumstances. Now, after 1919, the emergence of non-European great powers, the United States and Japan, means that, and I talked about this in the Japanese lecture last week, that Britain faces the circumstances where she can have problems overseas, where she faces a regional great power, where she cannot expect to get any kind of help from any of the European powers necessarily. So that the New World Order that emerges after 1919 is systemically different from that which had existed before the war. And Britain would have to find new means within this New World Order to ensure that her external interests were protected. Now, separate from the legacy of the First World War in this political sense is the intellectual inheritances of the First World War. And one of the major things to talk about here is the debate, the historical debate, about the origins of the conflict. And there are many reasons that were adduced after the First World War to try and explain the origins of the First World War. Problems of arms races, the problems with suppressed nationalities, old diplomacy, secret diplomacy that is, which is based on the balance of power and full of entangling secret alliances. All of these things in various combinations were put forward as the reasons for the First World War. And as a result, after the war, each of these was viewed with suspicion. Arms races were to be eliminated by the universal panacea of disarmament, something that is written into the Treaty of Versailles itself. Submerged nationalities were to be given their own states to rule or misrule as they pleased. And old diplomacy was to be replaced by what Woodrow Wilson, the American president, called open covenants openly arrived at. A phrase that is, of course, going to be a bugbear for all diplomacy in the interwar period. With the creation of the League of Nations, international disputes are to be resolved by discussion and arbitration. Those states that would refuse to be bound by these approaches would be coerced into acceptance by collective means. Although the collective means to be used and whether or not these would be effective were left somewhat vague, and the requirement of League members to participate in this public shaming was left completely voluntary. So once again, British policymakers are working in circumstances in which British interests are going to have to be defended by sharply different means than they were before the First World War. There's also a changed context with respect to the colonial empires. Before 1914, the challenges to the rights of Europeans to rule other people abroad was largely the domain of the lunatic fringe. By the end of the First World War, this is no longer the case. There are substantial movements which affect empire quite strongly. In India, of course, following things like the Amritsar uprising in 1919, there is a nationalist movement, or at least there is a group of people who want to portray themselves as a nationalist movement for their own ends. But there are also movements in the so-called White Dominions in Australia, Canada, New Zealand, and Australia, which take their most concrete form at the 1926 Imperial Conference and end up with the Statute of Westminster and the creation of more autonomy within the empire itself. And of course, there is always the problem of Ireland, which is in one sense resolved by the 1921-22 agreements. But in the newly acquired empire, there are problems here which are resolved in one sense by the granting of limited autonomy to places like Iraq, but this, of course, means that Britain still has to be involved in these areas, but the intellectual basis of the involvement has changed from before 1914. And clearly there's also a certain amount of concern within the British policy-making groups about their positions in places like China. Extraterritoriality, by 1926 it has been resolved, must go. Negotiations for it are underway. By 1930 it's nearly in place, and only the Japanese intervention in Manchuria puts this on hold. So that the entire relationship within the empire and the ethos of empire is profoundly affected by the First World War and quite sharply changed. There is also a changed domestic context for the defense policy and things. The attacks on secret diplomacy, for example, had led to a cry for greater democratization of the making of foreign policy. And the result of this is the creation of a number of extra-governmental bodies, things like the Royal Institute of International Affairs, the League of Nations Union, and the like, all of which bring a much greater public scrutiny to the making of policy than was the case before 1914. The Committee of Imperial Defense, the connection to empire is rather obvious from the name of it, is augmented by a series of other bodies created, things like the Chiefs of Staff Committee, the Advisory Committee on Trade Questions, the Principal Supply Officers. All of these committees bring a larger number of people's interests to bear upon the making of foreign policy in the interwar period. They widen the number of people who shape policy, and they ensure that a wider range of interests are affected or are considered in all policy making. Now, the military also affects foreign policy and British defense policy in another way, and this derives from two things: what kind of war the fighting services expected Britain to be involved in, and which war this would be. What war was to be fought, of course, was beyond the control of the military men, but what kind of war it would be was the subject of intense debate from 1919 to 1939. And this is an intellectual struggle which is made all the more fierce by the fact that funding is limited in this period, and that the resolving of these intellectual debates has a direct impact upon military budgets in all of this. This is particularly important when it is remembered that fighting forces or armed forces can fight effectively only the wars that they have prepared for, both in terms of doctrine and of equipment. The military equivalent of "you are what you eat" is that you fight how you train. But the relationship here is a dynamic one, for you train how you expect to have to fight. And this dynamic relationship also exists when we consider the material aspects of armed forces. Ideally, armed forces should choose the material that is appropriate for the battles that they plan to fight. But it is equally true that once the equipment is chosen, this largely determines how you can fight, or at least how you can fight effectively. And the problem varies from service to service in the interwar. The Royal Navy's role remained constant in all of this. It was to command the sea and thus protect Britain's interests globally. But how this was to be achieved in a climate of disarmament was not particularly clear. The Admiralty asserted that its needs remained absolute rather than relative. That is to say that regardless of potential opponents, the Navy had to maintain a certain level of equipment. But the Treasury, on the other hand, was adamant that economies had to be found. And this led to a running battle in the interwar between the two departments, one which the Royal Navy proved incapable of winning. The result was that many avenues of naval technology were cut off or else inadequately explored. Thus, intellectual debates about the impact of mines and submarine and air power was intertwined with and could not be separated from the day-to-day financial needs of running the Royal Navy. And in times of financial stringency, as you would expect, day-to-day operations took priorities, and the suggestions of such men as Admiral Richmond's for things like smaller battleships were largely ignored. Similar conundrums existed for the Army. Always the Cinderella service, the Army retained the dual role of defending the Empire and providing the sharp end for British diplomacy on the continent. However, in the context of the League and disarmament, and in the context of the tremendous losses during the First World War, the Army had difficulties making its arguments for funding. And the intellectual issues of mechanization, names like Little Hart and Fuller come to mind here, and the role of air power could be pursued only in a limited fashion. Only the RAF despite its recent birth and its initial struggles to remain an independent force, could launch a coherent intellectual argument. Air power, its advocates trumpeted, could defend sea lanes, police the empire, and provide some means of retaliation that would deter any political aggressor from attacking Britain itself. And this could be achieved relatively cheaply and did not involve the kinds of human costs that the Somme and Passchendaele had charged. Of course, this promise of security was only theoretical and highly dependent on an unproved technology that was rapidly changing. Those who made foreign policy, those who had to defend the British interests, had to make judgments and had to determine which was the substance and which was the shadow. And of course, errors here could be fatal. But perhaps the most important of all the intellectual matters that affected British strategic policy in this period is the issue of ideology. The First World War, at least in part, discredited the intellectual underpinnings of the long 19th century. Victorian notions of civilization and progress and social norms based on hierarchy and deference had been as battered by the attritional battles of the First World War as the trenches themselves. Politically, new creeds had emerged, each claiming to be the way to the future and arguing that the existing order was shop-worn and outmoded. For the British, perhaps the most compatible of these ideologies was the liberal internationalism espoused by Woodrow Wilson. This ideology had long roots in Britain itself, going back at least to those stalwarts of British liberalism, Richard Cobden and John Bright. For Wilson, as for Cobden and Bright, wars were inherently bad in themselves and something that stood in the way of economics man's quest for material gain. Since all people were deemed to be rational, and that rationality was thought to be, at least potentially and certainly inevitably, common to all, then all matters could be solved rationally. It was here that many of the pre-war radicals of the Liberal Party found their spiritual home in the 1920s and 30s. Of course, Wilsonianism, as exemplified by the League in Disarmament, was not accepted uncritically by all. Some, like Sir Maurice Hankey, the secretary to the CID and the Cabinet Office, had a darker view of the international scene and preferred what has been called conservative internationalism, which essentially meant the creation of an Anglo-American consortium, a sort of English-speaking union, to ensure that the New World Order created in 1919 remained safe and stable. Now, this found many adherents, especially amongst the Conservative Party, who were suspicious of Wilson's high-flown rhetoric and theoretical cloudiness, but liked the idea of gradual change in which their own supremacy was, of course, guaranteed. Other new ideologies, however, were much more threatening. Particularly worrying was Bolshevism. Now, I've talked a little bit about this in the Russian lecture, but Bolshevism in the 1920s is, of course, the Red Menace, which is such a feature of British adventure fiction of the time. And in fact, much of this adventure fiction is based loosely on actual events. I don't know whether you have been watching the reruns of Sidney Riley, Ace of Spies, but you'll see several of those, of the last episodes of Sidney Riley, of course, reflect this kind of trend. The Comintern, the Communist International, set up in Moscow in 1919 as a coordinating center for global communism, was in part set up as a countering force, in fact, to the League of Nations. For the British, the red threat was Hydra-headed. You find it everywhere. Soviet subversion is found throughout the British Empire and, in fact, around the Empire as well. In places like in Canada, where the Winnipeg General Strike is normally thought to have been inspired by Bolshevism. As I've talked about before, this is also seen as part of a pan-Turanian movement amongst the Turks as well. The defense of India is, of course, linked to this. India is thought under threat of Bolshevik subversion. Bolshevism also has a domestic face. You see it in the 1926 General Strike. You see it, of course, in the Arcos raid in 1927 and the like. And any examination of the pulp fiction of this era also sees this tied to the anti-Semitism that is so common in the 1920s and 1930s, given that so many of the Bolshevik leaders were, of course, Jewish. Mussolini's march on Rome and ascent to power in 1922 at first engendered little concern in Britain. This reflected the fact that Italy was not strong enough to be a real threat either to the empire or to the new world order created at Versailles. However, as Martin Pugh has recently demonstrated, fascism was a European-wide phenomenon which had roots in Britain itself. Bolshevism helped to fertilize these roots, and some patriotic organizations sprang up all over Britain, particularly amongst ex-servicemen who had difficulties in adjusting to the realities of a land fit for heroes. The membership of such groups was small but not uninfluential. They had patronage at the highest levels of society, people such as the Duke of Northumberland, the founder and financier of the right-wing newspaper, The Patriot. There were also a number of members and lots of sympathizers within the British intelligence community who saw the right-wing organizations as realistic people who were willing to take hard decisions to check the Red Menace that the more centrist politicians were likely to shirk. If we substitute one ideology for another, we can see certain relationships today that are quite similar here. Nonetheless, British fascism, even under the leadership of the charismatic Sir Oswald Mosley, was never able to attract a large following, and its domestic influence remained small. So too was the impact of Nazism. Hitler's National Socialism was difficult to export. Its roots were far too Teutonic and mystical to have much effect in Britain. Outside of those, such as the members of the Trust and various elements of Pan-Anglo-Saxonism who happened to like Wagner, Nazism remained an insignificant domestic threat to Britain, and its impact on British strategic policy was small. However, the play of ideology on British policy in the international arena was profound. In the 1920s, there was some hope that liberal or conservative internationalism would prove strong enough to maintain the New World Order. And this reflected the fact that the revisionist powers, those challengers, both actual and potential, of the status quo, were either too weak, in the case of Germany and Italy, too absorbed in domestic experiments, in the case of Soviet Russia, or temporarily willing to acquiesce in the New World Order, in the case of Japan. With the United States willing, albeit hesitatingly and reluctantly, to underpin the aspects of the peace settlement through the Dawes and Young's plan, there was a possibility that the post-war stability could develop into something permanent. And this, if any of you have had a chance to read Zara Steiner's new book, The Lights That Failed, you'll see this quite sharply underlined in her volume. And in the 1920s, means were found to get round the most impractical elements of Wilsonianism. While alliances and the balance of power remained anathema to many, Austen Chamberlain, the British Foreign Secretary in Baldwin's second government, demonstrated that, provided a League cloak could be thrown over it, a solution could be found to some of the more pressing international concerns. The Treaty of Locarno here, then, is the highlight of the interwar New World Order. It was an attempt to alleviate French concerns about security, concerns that prevented the French from being willing to bring Germany back into the Comity of Nations. The threat that this posed to the New World Order had been underlined by the French occupation of the Ruhr. Chamberlain was determined to square the circle. He did so by means of a conjurer's trick. By guaranteeing the borders of both France and Germany, he made the Locarno agreements appear to be compatible with the new mores of the League and of the New World Order itself. However, Locarno was really never meant to be implemented. Instead, it was a means to the broader end of assuring that the status quo would be changed only gradually and through negotiation. Now, this intention was not realized. Both the French and the Germans had entered into Locarno with their own agendas. Neither accepted the underlying concepts of liberal internationalism. Nor was Locarno something that could be replicated in other circumstances, as the failed attempts to imitate the Western Locarno with an Eastern Locarno and a Mediterranean Locarno in the 1930s demonstrated quite aptly. The problems of the 1930s also derived from other considerations. The revisionist powers, Nazi Germany, Fascist Italy, and militarist Japan, did not accept the New World Order in any intellectual sense. And in fact, they were hostile towards it. As a result of this, what tools did the British have to ensure that the international order remained a configuration that protected their interests? The actions of the revisionist power, Japan's initiation of the China Incident in 1931, and Hitler's accession to power, combined with the collapse of the Disarmament Conference in 1932, meant that one of the pillars of the New World Order, disarmament, had to be abandoned. This is why the Defense Requirements Subcommittee, which I've talked about in previous lectures, comes into existence in 1933 and is designed to check or to implement a new British defense policy based upon the use of force. However, financial stringency, the political fragility of the national government, and divided counsels as to the best means of assuring Britain's safety, which enemies, in what order, and how to defend against them, plus a lingering fear that public opinion would not accept a new arms race, meant that rearmament was both halting and incomplete. But if rearmament was both expensive and difficult to achieve, what else could be done? Any belief in the efficacy of the League was dealt a severe blow by the Abyssinian crisis, where it was clear that economic sanctions were difficult to impose and thus likely to be ineffectual. This meant that other means would have to be found to deter the revisionist powers. Here, the issues of mentalité and ideology came to the fore. Let us consider the means considered to deal with each of the three major threats. First, Japan. Once the militarist elements in that country set their course for the achievement of what they felt to be their national destiny, the British were faced with a difficult military and naval problem. The Washington system, inaugurated in 1922, proved ineffectual, as neither the United States nor Britain was willing to lead the way in checking Japan. Each preferred that the other take the initiative, each fearing that the other would take little concrete action to support them if they did. So, what remained for the British? Here opinions were divided. The Treasury wished to return to the Anglo-Japanese Treaty that had been allowed to elapse in 1921, arguing that such an agreement would protect British interests without involving the need for an expensive naval race. Since funds were not likely to be forthcoming, this position was accepted by the Admiralty, which really preferred a two-ocean navy, but realized that it could not muster the political support to obtain it. The Foreign Office, on the other hand, deprecated this policy. They argued that such a policy was doomed to failure by two things. First, that no Japanese government, neither the so-called moderates nor the militarists, would agree to a Far Eastern settlement that would ensure British interests were protected. Asia for the Asians, the credo at the heart of the Greater East Asian co-prosperity sphere, would not permit a place for Britain. Second, such a policy would alienate the United States, something that the Foreign Office deemed an even greater calamity than the effects that Japanese aggression could have on British interests. Again, here we're seeing the impact of two non-European powers on British thinking. At the bottom of the quarrel between the two departments was a clash of mentalité. The Treasury believed that Japan was motivated by economic rationalism, something at the core of liberal internationalism, and would see that economic cooperation in China was more cost-effective than war with Britain or the United States. The Foreign Office, on the other hand, realized that the Japanese were impelled to action by a sense of destiny, and that those in charge of Japan's policy were impervious to the logic espoused by the Treasury. This, of course, led to personal quarrels. Warren Fisher, the head of the Treasury and the head of the civil service at this point, referred to one of the leading advocates of the Foreign Office's point of view as Sir Charles Ord as, quote, a pedantic ass, admirably suited to join the eclectic brotherhood of Oxford or Cambridge. His pedantry is only equalled by his quite obvious ignorance of human nature, and at the same time he is obsessed with the fixed idea that original sin is monopolized by Japan, and our only proper attitude is, therefore, never to soil ourselves by contact with such impiety. This divergence in the estimates of Japan's motives and how far Britain could deal with her persisted right up to Pearl Harbor. The major exponents of doing a deal with Japan, the Treasury, the British ambassador in Japan from 1937 to 1941, Sir Robert Craigie, and most importantly Neville Chamberlain, all shared a belief that an Anglo-Japanese compromise was possible. None appreciated that the intellectual basis of Japanese policy was something which was not compatible with such a solution. Second, Italy. Here matters are somewhat simpler. For the most part, the British simply refused to take Italy seriously. This reflected the fact that Italy was too weak in itself to be a major threat to British interests. Italy could be a complication, and its actions in Abyssinia and the Spanish Civil War were irritants to Britain. However, by itself, Italy was incapable of upsetting the New World Order. Only in conjunction with the greater threats posed by Nazi Germany and militarist Japan was Italy worthy of real consideration. Since without the threats that the former pair posed, British power was certainly capable of dealing with the Duce's pretensions. So, British policy needed to ensure that Italy did not act in concert with either Germany or Italy. Here, Neville Chamberlain was incapable of understanding the fact that Mussolini, despite or perhaps because of his rodomontade, was an ideologue. The Duce had ambitions far in excess of Italy's capabilities to achieve them. Seeing Italy's position, in one sense more clearly than that of Mussolini himself, Chamberlain attempted to wean the Italian dictator away from Germany through clandestine diplomacy. However, this was bound to fail, since Chamberlain's cool logic and offers of economic concessions failed to meet in any way Mussolini's visions of fascist grandeur. Indeed, the idea that he could be bought with concessions only fueled Mussolini's irritation over the fact that Italy was not strong enough to carry out his vision by force of arms, and this made him determined to rectify this latter omission. Finally, Germany. Here, of course, the story is well known. Chamberlain attempted to conciliate Hitler by offering economic deals, colonial concessions, and the elimination of territorial grievances. None proved effective, since Hitler, the sleepwalker, as he often termed himself, had in mind a far more grandiose future than liberal or conservative internationalism would allow. And, unlike Mussolini, Hitler had the material means to attempt to achieve his goals by force. What were the alternative means to check these depredations, and why were they not adopted? The most obvious was a return to the balance of power politics of pre-1914 Europe. The intellectual debate over doing so can best be seen by looking at one example, the Franco-Soviet Pact of 1935. The comments of Sir Orm Sargent, Deputy Under-Secretary at the Foreign Office, when he contemplated the formation of the pact, give a quick insight into the way that such a reversion to the methods of 1914 was viewed. But the prospect of a return to the pre-war grouping of powers is so horrible, he said, and a Franco-Russian alliance would be the first step towards it and would be quickly followed by others, that I feel we ought to be able to show that in all events we had exhausted every method in order to prevent this development. On another occasion, he expanded on his objections. The link between Moscow and Paris, he said, would be the signal for an immediate regrouping of the powers under the pre-war system of the balance of power, organized on the basis of exclusive, mutually antagonistic alliances. It would thus mean the final abandonment of the collective security peace system and all that it stands for. For him, such an occurrence was anathema. Others, on the other hand, were not so sure. Lawrence Collier, the head of the Northern Department of the Foreign Office, which dealt with the Soviet Union, argued, quote, "We are already back in the days of the balance of power, and that it is hopeless to expect anything else in dealing with such protagonists of sacro egoismo as Messrs. Hitler, Mussolini, Pilsudski, and Stalin." The quarrel between the two men reflected their differing approaches to maintaining Britain's interests, and these approaches rested on differing conceptual understandings of how international relations could be managed. The impact of ideas was nowhere more evident than when dealing with Soviet Russia. A quick survey of some key opinion makers, the permanent undersecretaries at Foreign Office, makes it clear how diverse these opinions were. For Sir William Tyrrell, permanent undersecretary from 1925 to 1928, Moscow was an implacable enemy. In 1926, Tyrrell wrote that, quote, "Ever since the Bolshevist regime was established in Russia, its activities have been mainly directed against this country, and that in every part of the world we have been met by its persistent and consistent hostility." Tyrrell's successor, Sir Ronald Lindsay, was dramatically aware of Soviet intrigues, having served before he became permanent undersecretary on the Interdepartmental Committee on Bolshevism as a menace to the British Empire, a body whose very title makes quite clear its views of Moscow. The subsequent permanent undersecretary, Sir Robert Van Sittart, was less categorical in his treatment of Soviet Russia. Van was much more willing to utilize the Soviets as a means to check Japanese depredations in China and German threats of expansion in Europe. However, that did not mean that he viewed Moscow as a friend to Britain or as a reliable partner. His views, in fact, were more closely aligned to those of Collier, who argued that, quote, "Since we live among a number of powers, few of whom really wish us well, but some of whom have the same interests as ourselves, we should, whenever possible, encourage the latter to join with us in defending the status quo against those who, in their own interests, see that it demands to be overthrown." Collier would not be deterred from reaching an accord with Soviet Russia because of its ideological position, but others were less willing to overlook the ideological impact of Bolshevism. Stanley Baldwin's anti-communism was notorious. As he told a group of Conservative MPs in July 1936, "There is one danger, of course, which has probably been on all your minds. Supposing the Russians and Germans got fighting and the French went in as allies of Russia, owing to that appalling pact they made, you would not feel you were obligated to go and help France, would you? If there's any fighting in Europe to be done, I should like to see the Bolsheviks and the Nazis doing it." Anthony Eden, Foreign Secretary in the 1930s, was also not fond of Moscow. While he was willing, if absolutely necessary, to treat with them, he did not wish to make it a close collaboration. "I want good relations with the Bear," he noted in 1936 during the negotiation of an Anglo-Soviet loan. "But I don't want to stand too close. I don't trust him, and I am sure that there is hatred in his heart for all we stand for." Neville Chamberlain had a similar view. "I must confess the most pronounced distrust of Russia," the Prime Minister wrote to his sister Ida in March of 1939, when the possibility of an Anglo-Soviet alliance is mooted. "I have no belief whatever in her ability to maintain an effective offensive, and I distrust her motives, which seem to me to have little connection with our ideas of liberty, and to be concerned only with getting everyone else by the ears." Such an attitude lay behind all the alliance negotiations of 1939, making them even more difficult than would otherwise have been the case. So, what can we say in conclusion? In conclusion, I believe that it is clear that the 20-year crisis, as E.H. Carr called it, between 1919 and 1939, was due as much to intellectual issues for Britain than it was to anything else. British policy was poised uneasily between the verities of the 19th century balance of power and the bipolar structure of the Cold War. The new world order created at Versailles eliminated many of the measures that had allowed Britain to maintain her international position before 1914, but had not produced effective alternatives. Collective security rested on a number of liberal international suppositions, which the events of the 1930s showed to be correct. Revisionist regimes espoused doctrines that ran entirely counter to the founding tenets of the New World Order and were actively hostile to them. This meant that British policy foundered, its flaccidity a result of its lacking a coherent intellectual core, rather than any aspects of decline or appeasement. Appeasement, as is used now with its overtones of moral weakness and timidity, is a completely inadequate term to describe the intellectual crisis. Appeasement, in fact, was, as Paul Kennedy pointed out nearly 30 years ago, all that was best in British liberal internationalism, for it was a policy of conciliation based on the assumption that reasonable men could find reasonable solutions to their differences. It cannot be made the basis for our understanding of British policy. Instead, we need to think hard about ideas and to see the interwar as a period of time in which Britain struggled to find the acceptable means of dealing with those who had ideas and policy which could not be situated within the confines of liberal democracy. This is a dilemma that should be familiar to us all at the present time. Thank you very much.
Professor Nielsen was asked the following 6 questions. Question 1. Can you talk about what was the intellectual geography of the British policy-making elite in the 20s and 30s, and where the sea changes were about the question of Europe first or Empire first?
Well, it's a very broad-ranging question. I'm not sure that I can really give you an entirely satisfactory answer to it, but I will try. It seems to me that what underpins British policy in the 20s and 30s, just as it does at the present time, is a certain amount of ambivalence about all of this. The First World War had demonstrated entirely the United States was, potentially at least, the greatest power in the world. I think even the most fervent advocates of the British Empire believed this was the case. But not all of them believed that being friends with the United States and the British Empire were necessarily incompatible, because many of them, of course, had strong beliefs about Pan-Anglo-Saxonism, English-speaking world, and the like. And the liberal, not the liberal internationalists, but the liberal conservatives believed that there was a natural affinity between the United States and Britain that could be utilized to maintain what you might call a white man's world. The Anglo-Saxon English speakers would run the entire world for the proper benefit of all, even if the rest of the world didn't want that. But the trouble with this, of course, is that the people who tended to support this conservative internationalism were also often people who were very keen on the empire as such, and would also try and follow up this with things like the end of free trade and the like, not understanding that the United States was based on ideas more along the lines of 19th century liberalism when it comes to talking about free trade and the like, and that any efforts to try and either divide the world up into an Anglo or an American block of traders, or to try and keep the Americans out of certain things, was bound to generate an enormous amount of friction. And this friction is the kind of thing that Michael Hogan talks about when he talks about competitive cooperation between Britain and the United States. They do share certain values and certain ideas, and a war between them seems quite inconceivable, and often you can say, well, and I'm sure that when the push comes to shove, the Americans will help us. But at the same time, American capitalists want to compete with British capitalists and the like, and they're quite willing to cut their throats. And there is, of course, another strong element in the United States. This is the anti-imperial element, the one that wants to get rid of the British Empire and the like. So on that front, there's a whole series of divisions where you can't really say what's sort of the general line of anybody. It's very difficult to know. Now, with respect to Europe, there are the Eurosceptics of their time, as it were. And interestingly enough, they're on both sides, both left and right. There are the conservatives who just view the French as they have for 700 years, as the annoying frogs across the channel who always cause you difficulty. But then there are those who are opposed to things like entangling alliances and such like that on the political left, who argue that France inveigled Britain into the First World War through the Entente. This was part and parcel of secret diplomacy. The result was the flower of British manhood dying in the fields of France for the French, rather than thinking in broader terms of all of this. So these folks are opposed to anything. Then there are those who think that really the future lies with an established world order, and that you can't have an established world order without getting rid of the lingering antagonism between Germany and France. This is the sort of the ideas behind the Locarno policy. Once you can get rid of French concerns about security by guaranteeing France against Germany and Germany against France, then perhaps you can inveigle, lead, hope that the French will be willing to pursue policies which will allow Germany to be reintegrated into the European economy. And as soon as you can do that, that'll be for the benefit of all. This is sort of an aspect of 19th century liberalism coming into play here. And indeed, this kind of attitude is also held by some with respect to the Soviet Union. People from the Labour Party, Lloyd George, all of these believed that Bolshevism could be tamed. That Bolshevism, if you were able to bring the Soviets into trade, establish trading relations with them, they'd see that it was to their advantage to do so. Gradually, they'd lose these silly ideas, and they become just like us. Underpinning this, in all cases, I think, is an inability to understand that there can be intellectual constructs which reject the very idea of getting along with somebody else because that other person is wrong. This is certainly something we see with the idea about having democracy in Iraq, or when people talk about the irrationality of suicide bombers and the like. These are not irrational acts. They're just based on a different value system that doesn't coincide with our own. And what you have to do is you have to understand that, and then you have to decide, do you just tolerate it or do you get rid of it? But there is no question of finding some sort of modus vivendi, no middle ground, when you have incompatible systems. Certainly, you cannot square up Nazism or communism, Stalinism, with Western-style democracy. They just come from intellectual roots that are absolutely anathema to one another.
Question 2. What is it about the intellectual underpinnings of liberal internationalism that prevents liberal internationalists from seeing things as they are?
I truly believe there is a clash of civilization. I don't believe that these are resolved by rational means at all. They've never been resolved by rational means in our own culture. If you look at the problems with church and state, it takes things like the investiture controversy, it takes creating extra popes, it requires the wars of religion and the like to force Western Europe to come to the realization that religious tolerance, or that religion has to be treated as a personal matter rather than as a state matter, to make this work very effectively. And of course, I mean, if you look at religious aspects of the IRA, that clearly doesn't resolve itself entirely at all. So if you have two systems where nothing is derived from fact, it's derived from belief, you can't reconcile beliefs. One set of beliefs says this, one set of beliefs says the other. They are incompatible with one another. Now, either you assume that these are personal things and they shouldn't be acted upon in the public sphere, which is a very Western notion, or you assume that these things are not, that they must be acted upon in the public sphere. The creation of a Sharia-based kind of justice system, for example, quite underpins this. If you believe the latter, you can't reconcile this with the former. What was the problem in the interwar? Was a complete failure to understand that this basic dichotomy. It's an economic determinism based upon the ideas of the 19th century, just in the same way that actually Marxism is. They come from exactly the same roots. They just go in somewhat different directions. Both sides believe in an economic man, that the greatest good for the greatest number is achieved by each individual pursuing economic goals, sort of in Adam Smith's terms, without the hand of the government interfering. If you don't believe in those sorts of things, if you have a belief, say the Nazis do, some sort of heroic mythical past which you're going to go to in a heroic future, or if you believe, as the fascists do, that it's only the greatest good of the greatest number acting as a group, or if you have Japan's idea of some sort of divine mission, these things don't square up at all. You either have to reject your own belief system to understand these things, or you have to be able to make the intellectual leap, something that someone like Neville Chamberlain was never capable of doing. It's this foolish belief of why can't we all just get along? And people who say silly things like, oh, wherever you go in the world, people are all alike, really. Well, as soon as you say that, you've never been anywhere. Even in a group like this, where we're divided by a common language, I only barely understand the English. I think I understand Scots better than Englishmen, and I don't understand the Welsh at all, both literally and figuratively. And Americans that I live next door to, I don't understand their underpinnings all that well. And when you get into people outside your own language group with differing cultural backgrounds, I don't believe that you can resolve these issues. And thus, I believe you have to reject other people by force of arms if necessary. If they're not willing just to get along, then you carry a big stick.
Question 3. Appeasement is an idea where reasonable men can come to some reasonable accommodation. The problem with that was, it doesn't work if you are not dealing with reasonable ideas. How was it that right at the heart of British government, for quite a long time, you had people who probably wouldn't have liked to have been called appeasers, but nonetheless, the sort of gestures they were making were appeasing Hitler or Mussolini?
If you look at somebody like Robert Cecil, who I quite actually like Robert Cecil in many ways. Robert Cecil has a long debate with Morris Hankey about this in the 1920s, and they're talking about how do you have a nice world? How do you lack war? Cecil writes to Hankey, says, you think that you go by the Roman maxim, if you wish to have peace, prepare for war. I go by the maxim, if you wish to have peace, prepare for peace. Your way means that we have to have a war every 20 years with the Germans. I don't think that this is a very good idea. And in fact, that I think that this will lead to worse results than the ideas that I have. So, it's the triumph of optimism, in a sense, over reality. And I think it's also the fact that the First World War killed an awful lot of people. And many people didn't want to have this happen again. They were just unwilling to do this, quite understandably. And I have great sympathy for this position, even though I believe it to be muddle-headed. Tom Paine said about, the tree of liberty has to be watered by the blood of patriots. I believe that to be the case, actually. And there have to be things which you're willing to stand up for and to die for. Otherwise, you will lose those things.
Question 4. Prior to World War II, politicians appear to share the belief with some of the military that the next war would be like the First World War. Could you discuss why that belief was so universal compared with the German or Soviet approach to war?
Well, German and Soviet approaches are different because they see war differently. And the Soviets, of course, believe that it's an inevitable consequence. Everything else is an epiphenomenon in all of this. And the Nazis, of course, see war as a glorious end of itself, as do the fascists. But there are two really different opinions about war amongst politicians in the interwar. First, there's the ones that people want to get reelected. How are you going to tell people they're going to lose another 900,000 men or another 740,000, have the sum? But there's also, I think, a greater belief, one that's more prevalent and perhaps more important in all this, and that's the belief, the absolutely absurd belief about the impact of aerial warfare. A belief that, based upon extrapolations from what happens with the few Zeppelin raids that happened over Britain in the First World War, that this will not only lead to tremendous damage, but it will lead to social unrest. And the slum dwellers of the East End will come pouring out, and ravish the maidens of the West End. It was believed that it would destroy the social fabric of things and bring an end to the existing order. And therefore, it's interesting if you look at the efforts at disarmament. Everybody wants to get rid of the things that they don't like. The British say that the Navy is a good thing because it's not offensive. The Germans go for armies, but the British are really adamantly opposed to aerial bombardment because, of course, they can be bombarded by other people. But Neville Chamberlain, on the other hand, his reason for not wanting to spend money on sending an army to the continent is he believes in a massive deterrent. You will create an air force such that anyone who does anything will suffer such catastrophic damage that it will be, in his best businessman's calculation, won't be good for your economy, will it? You'll become poor. You'll be all broke. Not realizing that Hitler doesn't quite think like that. Hitler's thinking more, what about my Lebensraum in all of this? So there is this issue. So I think that the technological aspect of it, it's rather like nuclear weapons in that sense. Many people believe that the fear of air warfare would deter war. In a sense, I suppose nuclear weapons did deter war to some extent in the 1950s and 60s, and hopefully carrying on into the future.
Question 5. In your presentation, you appear to have been looking at the late 1930s. But do you agree that in the 20s and 30s, Mussolini might have had a bigger platform in European foreign policy, particularly given the rearmament of Italy from 1928 to 31? And the British did take him quite seriously until they realised that by the mid-30s, Italy could not compete in the rearmament process.
Oh, absolutely. I'd agree with you entirely. Mussolini, I suppose the highlight of the Italians is maybe 1936 when the Regia Aeronautica is the best air force in Europe, before everyone else gets rearmament underway. But never for a moment do the British consider that they can't deal with the Italians simply because of geography. They can always just put the Royal Navy alongside Italy and bombard the hell out of Italy and cut off Italy's seaborne trade entirely. So they're always quite convinced that they can put enough pressure on the Italians to deal with them quite comfortably. But yes, certainly Italy's a pretty decent player in the late 1920s in all of this. But it's because of a competing ideological approach to the use of violence. I mean, if you glorify violence as the fascists do, then you obviously have to at least make... It's sort of like Italian opera in that sense. It's tremendously splendid and filled with wonderful phrases, but very short and intellectual content. It's when you get to a little more serious Wagnerian drama where everything gets a little darker and somewhat scarier. You know, you have your Votans there. It gets way more frightening than Così fan tutti or something.
Question 6. You use various terms like liberal internationalists and liberal conservatives, which are good terms for international relations theory. But how useful are they in terms of their heritage, going back to a period where perhaps people didn't use those terms?
Actually, they do. The term Wilsonianism is used all the time about Woodrow Wilson's ideas, and the pre-war British radicals would use exactly this kind. There's an international language for this sort of thing, for political discussion before the First World War, which is given a lot more scope by Woodrow Wilson's espousing of it during the First World War and at Versailles and afterwards. And the League of Nations, of course, is a talking shop for these kinds of ideas as well. The terms liberal internationalism and conservative internationalism are scholarly constructs, which I use here in that sense. But Wilsonianism can be used interchangeably with these and is the historical kind of phrase that would be used at the time. Or before the First World War, people will just talk about internationalism. That's the kind of phrase often used by the socialists as well in all of this. This isn't a projection on the past of ideas. It's sort of a going back and giving them a categorical name, so it's easier to talk about them and giving them some sort of resonance for the present. But it isn't at all, I think, any kind of construct. These ideas were certainly very much in the air and very much discussed and very much part of the intellectual debate on these things. Lenin, for example, was always arguing with these kinds of people. These were the butter communists, the kinds of people who provided very bad ideas that weakened good communists and made them into revisionists. Eduard Bernstein and people like this would talk in these kinds of terms as well. Very bad ideas. Could weaken the purity of communism.
Professor Nielsen can be contacted by email at Nielsen, that's Neilson, -K @rmc.ca.